The emperor had never spoken directly to his people before. His voice was about to break centuries of tradition. But first, he had to face his generals. August 1945. The emperor's voice echoed through the palace halls. Japan would surrender. But some generals refused to believe it, and their reactions changed everything that followed in those final hours. One general wept openly in the imperial chamber. Another reached for his weapon with trembling hands. The third made a choice that nearly destroyed Tokyo itself, because what they said next would determine whether the war truly ended or if Japan would face total destruction in one final, desperate stand. The moment everything changed. August 14th, 1945. Tokyo. The imperial palace was silent. Japan's top generals sat in a room together. They had fought for years. They had never lost before. Then the emperor walked in. His face was calm, but his hands were not. He carried a single piece of paper. The room felt heavy. No one spoke, no one moved. The emperor looked at each general slowly. Then he said something no one expected. "The war will end. We will surrender." The words hung in the air. General Anami's face went pale. General Umezu closed his eyes. General Toyoda gripped the edge of the table. These men had sent millions into battle. They had promised victory until the very end. Now their emperor was asking them to accept defeat. But not everyone in that room was ready to obey. And what happened next would determine if Japan survived the night. The general who couldn't speak. General Anami was the war minister. He was known as the toughest man in Japan. Soldiers feared him, enemies respected him. He had never shown weakness. But now his lips were shaking. The emperor finished speaking. He left the room quietly. The generals remained seated. No one looked at each other. The silence felt like a weight pressing down. Finally, Anami stood up. His uniform was perfect as always, but his eyes were wet. He walked to the window. He stared out at the city below. "I will obey," he whispered. His voice was barely there. "But I cannot accept this." An aide stepped closer. "Sir, what will you do?" Anami turned around slowly. His face was different now. It was the face of a man who had already made his decision. "I will follow the emperor's order, but I will not live to see Japan under enemy control." The other generals understood immediately, and they knew what was coming. The rebellion that almost happened. Not everyone agreed to surrender. Some younger officers were furious. They believed Japan could still fight. They believed surrender was shameful. A group of them gathered secretly that same night. Their leader was Major Hatanaka. He was only 33 years old, but he was passionate. He was dangerous. He had a plan. "We can stop this," he told his men. "We can take over the palace. We can destroy the surrender message before it reaches the people." The others listened carefully. Hatanaka's eyes were wild with determination. "If we act now, the war continues. Japan fights on. We die with honor." The officers nodded. They agreed. They prepared weapons. They moved toward the imperial palace under the cover of darkness. But they needed help from someone powerful. They needed a general to lead them. They went to find General Mory, the commander of the palace guards. What happened when they reached him changed everything. And the clock was ticking. The confrontation at midnight. Major Hatanaka and his men arrived at General Mory's office. It was just past midnight. The general was still working. He looked tired. He looked old. "General Mory," Hatanaka said firmly. "Japan needs you. We are stopping the surrender. Join us." General Mory looked up slowly. He did not seem surprised. He had expected this. "No," he said simply. "The Emperor has decided. We must obey." Hatanaka's face turned red. "You would betray your country?" "I would obey my Emperor," Mory replied calmly. The room went quiet. The other officers looked at each other. Hatanaka's hand moved to his weapon, his fingers wrapped around it. "Then you leave us no choice," he said coldly. Moments later, General Mory fell. The rebels took control of the palace. They searched everywhere for the Emperor's recorded surrender message. They had to find it. They had to destroy it. But the message was already gone, hidden, safe. And morning was coming fast.
The search for the recording. The Emperor had recorded his surrender announcement earlier that day. His voice was captured on 2 records. These records would be broadcast to the entire nation. The Japanese people would hear their emperor speak for the first time ever. But the rebels wanted those records destroyed. They tore through the palace. They opened every door. They searched every room. They questioned everyone they found. "Where is the recording?" they demanded. "Tell us now." No one spoke. Palace staff stayed silent. They had hidden the records well. They had placed them in an unlikely spot, a place no one would think to look. The rebels grew desperate. Hours passed. The sun was starting to rise. Their window was closing. If they did not find those records soon, Japan would hear the surrender message. The war would end. Hatanaka refused to give up. "Keep searching," he ordered. "It has to be here somewhere." But deep in the palace, something else was happening. Something the rebels did not know about. And it would end their mission. The general's final choice. Back at his home, General Anami sat alone. He had returned from the palace hours ago. He had spoken to no one. He had written letters to his family. He had written letters to the emperor. His mind was made up. Anami believed in honor above all else. He believed in loyalty. He believed in duty. But he also believed that Japan's defeat was his failure. He was the war minister. The losses were his responsibility. Millions had fallen under his command. He could not live with that burden. As dawn approached, Anami dressed in his formal uniform one last time. He knelt on the floor. He placed his sword in front of him. He took several deep breaths. Then he picked up the blade. What he did next was the old way, the warrior's way. It was painful. It was slow. But it was his choice. His final act of loyalty to an empire that no longer existed. When his aide found him hours later, Anami was gone. But he had left something behind, a message that explained everything. The emperor's voice reached the people. August 15th, 1945. Noon. Every radio in Japan was on. People gathered in streets. They gathered in homes. They gathered in factories. No one knew what was coming. Then they heard a sound they had never heard before. A voice, high-pitched, formal, ancient. It was the emperor. "We have resolved to endure the unendurable," he said. His words were difficult to understand. He spoke in old court language, but the meaning was clear. Japan had lost. The war was over. People fell to their knees. Some cried. Some were silent. Some felt relief. Some felt shame. But everyone listened until the very end. The emperor's voice carried across the entire nation. The rebels heard it too. Their mission had failed. Major Hatanaka stood in the palace courtyard. He listened to every word. When it ended, he removed his weapon. He pointed it at himself. Then he made his final choice. The rebellion was over. The war was over. But the words those generals spoke in those final hours would be remembered forever. What they left behind. General Anami's final message was found beside him. It was written in perfect calligraphy. It said, "I apologize to the Emperor for my great crime." He took full responsibility for Japan's defeat. He chose honor above all else. General Umezu and General Toyota both signed the surrender documents days later. They stood on the deck of an American ship. Their faces showed nothing, but inside they carried the same burden Anami had felt. These men had led an empire. They had controlled armies. They had believed in victory until the very end. But when their emperor asked them to surrender, most of them obeyed. Not because they agreed, but because loyalty mattered more than pride. The rebels who tried to stop the surrender were removed from history. Their names were rarely spoken again. Their actions were seen as a final desperate attempt to deny reality. Japan rebuilt. The generals were gone. But their final words and choices showed something important. They showed that even in defeat, how you face the end defines who you were. And sometimes the hardest battle is accepting that the war is over. The emperor's voice ended the largest conflict in human history. His generals made their final choices in those last hours. Some obeyed. Some resisted. One chose the warrior's path. Their statements during Japan's unconditional surrender shaped how the nation faced defeat. The document was signed. Victory over Japan arrived. But what they said and did in those final moments taught the world something deeper, about loyalty, honor, and accepting when the battle ends.